Welcome, everyone. A warm welcome. My name is Tanya Maletic. I'm the Assistant Director of the University of Melbourne's Initiative for Peacebuilding. I would like to begin by acknowledging that I join you from the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to elders past and present and extend this acknowledgement and respect to First Nations peoples on the lands on which you may be joining us today. Along with the Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies Northeast Asia Program Director Alison Lee, we warmly welcome you to this important discussion of how a peace-first approach can resolve the security crisis on the Korean Peninsula. The Initiative for Peacebuilding, in collaboration with the Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies, are so pleased that we can host the Australian launch of the timely new report published this year titled Path to Peace, the Case for a Peace Agreement to End the Korea War. Released by Korea Peacenow, a global coalition of women's peace organisations, and written by a collective international group of experts, the report makes a really compelling case that a peace agreement would lower tensions and make room for progress on issues such as improved human rights and denuclearisation. Additionally, the report highlights the legal and practical reasons for including women in a peace process to end the Korean War. And we have a real powerhouse of women on our panel today to both discuss the substantive issues in the report, as well as to share reflections and thoughts. And it's such a particularly important time to have more dynamic discussions about new approaches in this region. And it's at a time where we have South Korea President Moon Jae-in in Canberra at present, and recent optimism from South Korea, and ongoing, that's coupled with ongoing concerns about increasing militarisation and nuclearised securitisation. So we are very grateful to our extraordinarily knowledgeable Path to Peace panellists that include Christine Ann, who is the Executive Director of Women Cross DMZ and a co-author of the report, Mary Joyce, who is the Northeast Asia Regional Liaison Officer for the Global Partnerships for the Prevention of Armed Conflict, GPAC. She's also part of Women Cross DMZ and the Goodwill Ambassador for Peace on the Korean Peninsula. We are thrilled to have with us Associate Professor Jae Song, Korea Foundation Senior Lecturer in Korean Studies and Research Coordinator for Migration, Gender and Environment at the Asia Institute here at the University of Melbourne. And our collaborator on this event, Dr. Emma Leslie, who is the Director for the Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies, Cambodia. We're thrilled to hear from each of our panellists and then to open the floor to participant Q&A. So you'll be able to put your questions into the chat box. Following our speakers, we will open and invite your thoughts and questions. So welcome, Christine. We're so looking forward to hearing more about the key aspects of the report and your collective efforts towards working towards a peace agreement to end the Korean War. Welcome, Christine.
Thank you so much, Tanya. And I thank you for that. I love being on Zoom webinars with people from Australia and also New Zealand, because you recognize the Indigenous people. So I'm also calling in from the Kingdom of Hawaii, which has been occupied by the United States, but is now one of the 50 states. So I send warm greetings from Women Cross DMZ and the Korea Peacenow campaign. It's such a great pleasure to be with all of you and to be joined by my esteemed panelists, Mary and Emma, who have done so much to advance peace in Korea and in the region, and Dr. Jae Song, whose scholarship has advanced our understanding about North Korean migrants and their networks. She's so fabulous. And I'd love to also thank you, Tanya and the Initiative for Peacebuilding of the University of Melbourne for hosting this event. It's so crucial to strengthen relationships across national boundaries, especially with peace-loving Australians who can play a role to help end the Korean War. So I have a presentation I'd like to share. So let me see, full screen. Hopefully everybody can, oh no, we don't want to do that. Okay, there we go. So for those who are new to the Korea Peacenow campaign, it was started in 2019 by Women Across DMZ, along with the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, the Nobel Women's Initiative, and the Korean Women's Movement for Peace, which is a coalition of South Korean women's peace organizations. And so we call for formal end to the Korean War with the peace agreement and women's inclusion in the peace process. Today, I would like to cover the current political context, including the Biden administration's DPRK policy and the main points from the Path to Peace report on why a peace-first approach can resolve the security crisis on the Korean Peninsula. Let me begin by assessing first the US policy on North Korea. This spring, the Biden administration conducted its North Korea policy review and concluded that our goal remains the complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Senior Biden officials have said they will honor the Singapore Declaration and past agreements while also maintaining continued pressure on North Korea. So they're somewhere between strategic patience and maximum pressure. They say they are willing to meet with North Korea anywhere, anytime. But frankly, without substantive policy changes to the US approach towards North Korea, Pyongyang has been willing to engage. Essentially, US DPRK relations have remained deadlocked since the Hanoi summit in 2019. Meanwhile, North Korea continues to develop its nuclear arsenal. Yet, after a stalemate, there appears to be some movement. The US and South Korea and China are reportedly discussing an end of war declaration, but both sides remain at an impasse over how to include language about denuclearization. Today, I guess Moon announced also that North Korea is also on board. While a non-binding end of war declaration can be a stepping stone toward permanent peace and normalized relations, to succeed, it must be accompanied by fundamental shifts in US policy, as well as commitments by all sides to reduce hostilities and build trust. That might include steps such as lifting sanctions and stopping provocative military exercises with South Korea, as well as from the US side, ending a travel ban on Americans traveling to North Korea to allow family reunions and people-to-people exchanges. Even better than an end of war declaration would be a binding peace agreement to formally end the Korean War. In our report, Path to Peace, we argue that a peace-first approach is the most realistic and effective method of resolving the security crisis. Why a peace agreement? Failing to officially end the Korean War has fueled a low trust, low communication environment in which renewed conflict could break out at any time. If war broke out on the Korean Peninsula today, it is estimated that 300,000 people in South Korea would die in the first few days of fighting with conventional weapons. And if nuclear weapons were used, up to 25 million people would perish. A peace agreement would take the threat of using force off the table. As outlined in our Path to Peace report, a peace agreement must follow the basic principle: peace now, peace first, peace without preconditions. All sides must recognize once and for all that the wartime rights to use force have ended. Such a peace, under which powerful armies would no longer stand by, but stand down and stand back, would reduce nuclear tensions, facilitate discussions on arms control and human rights in Korea, and improve ordinary people's lives through the easing of economic sanctions and the reduction of crushing military spending, which we all know from all of our countries is taking place. And it argues that the greater involvement of women in the peace process, the greater the chance for success. So the first issue is on denuclearization, obviously. The nuclear crisis on the Korean Peninsula did not start with North Korea. At the outbreak of the war in 1950, the US threatened to use nuclear weapons and then later introduced them into South Korea and held them there until the administration of George Bush Sr. Successive administrations, both Democrat and Republican, have more than a quarter century failed to stop North Korea's nuclear program. Insisting on denuclearization first, peace later, has prolonged and exacerbated the security crisis. Today, North Korea is believed to possess up to 40 nuclear warheads, and its long-range missiles may have the ability to strike anywhere on the US mainland. A peace-first approach is key to de-escalating the nuclear standoff and creating space for a negotiated resolution. This is why a peace agreement would reduce the risk of an intentional or accidental nuclear escalation. A peace agreement would not legally imply recognition of North Korea as a nuclear weapon state, as these are two distinct issues. The Treaty on Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, the NPT, only recognizes those states that detonated a nuclear weapon before 1967. Therefore, North Korea cannot claim being a nuclear weapons state. Concluding a peace agreement before denuclearization is not, quote, reward for bad behavior. Such an agreement could include disarmament provisions, such as a verifiable freeze of North Korea's nuclear program with corresponding measures. The most desirable course of action is for all nuclear armed states to join the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Another issue that is often raised as an obstacle to advancing a peace agreement is about the Us Rok Alliance. A peace agreement would advance the goals of the alliance, the security of both countries, and recalibrate the militaristic relationship in much needed ways. Remaining in the unresolved state of war heightens the risk of renewed military conflict and is hardly reconcilable with the original intent of the alliance, which was to deter, quote unquote, communist aggression. In fact, the US ROK joint military exercises have been shown to provoke North Korea. Legally, a peace agreement would have no bearing on the US ROK alliance or withdrawal of US troops from Korea, unless otherwise specified. The US-South Korea alliance was born out of the armistice situation, an unnatural state that was meant to be temporary. The US ROK Mutual Defense Treaty, on the other hand, provides that the alliance, quote, shall remain in force indefinitely, end quote, until either side decides to revoke it. The presence of US troops in South Korea is governed by the Mutual Defense Treaty and the Status of Forces Agreement, the SOFA, and neither are predicated on the war. South Korea has the sovereign right to invite or disinvite foreign troops on its soil. However, a state of peace would imply the dissolution of the UN command, which we know Australia was under the UN command in the Korean War. Prolonging the presence of the UN command, we argue, would be destabilizing because it would signal that the US is reserving the right to use force. Peace would allow the US-ROK relationship to progress from a military alliance to a new partnership that promotes peace on the peninsula and in the region. Another issue that is often used as an obstacle to a peace agreement is about human rights. Peace and human rights aren't in conflict with one another, but they are mutually reinforcing. Militarism, sanctions, and pressure have not helped the cause of human rights. The continued state of war and hostility only gives the North Korean government a ready-made justification for curtailing rights and liberties in the name of national security. Pyongyang frequently denounces what it considers the US's hostile policy as a root cause of its human rights challenges. In its second Universal Periodic Review, for example, North Korea identified US-led sanctions, quote, sanctions, pressures, and military threat as the, quote, most serious challenges and obstacles to its independent and peaceful development, as well as the enjoyment of human rights by Korean people. That's the North Korean government. North Korea has also insisted that the safeguard of, quote, national sovereignty is the precondition and indispensable necessity for the protection and promotion of human rights, end quote, and cited, for instance, restrictions on freedom of association and freedom of religion as necessary to safeguard the sovereignty against foreign subversion efforts. There are many reasons to believe a peace agreement could lead to positive human rights outcomes. A peace agreement and a transformed relationship would remove the North Korean government's ability to point to the ongoing war and threats of military force that they frequently invoke to justify repressive policies. A state of peace could also pave the way for the North Korean government to stop pouring its resources into weaponry and the expense of its people. I think we can all agree that all of our governments could afford to do that too. We are not arguing that a peace agreement is a magic solution for human rights in North Korea, nor are we dismissing the fact that North Korea's human rights is a matter of concern. But a peace agreement that formally ends the Korean War would likely improve people's lives, sap the militarism that undergirds abuses, and create the conditions to engage more effectively on human rights. Peace should be the default between nations, and those who argue otherwise should be tasked with explaining how the current sanctions regime and unended state of war promotes human rights. And unfortunately, I believe that is where much of the human rights discourse is still today. According to UN Special Rapporteur Thomas Quintana on the situation of DPRK human rights, he says, quote, "A declaration on peace and development in the Korean Peninsula and a swift resolution of the armistice status would create the atmosphere and space needed for further discussions on denuclearization, less isolation, more access, and respect for human rights," end quote. I'm almost done here now. Thanks for everyone being so patient, but it's like a massive report. The report also calls for the inclusion of women's groups and civil society in the peace process. That's because research shows that when women are involved in peace processes, an agreement is more likely to be reached and to last. Between 1991 and 2017, women's groups were involved in 71% of informal peace processes. Women's participation helps to legitimize the formal peace process among the public. This is, I like to include this quote because this is Joe Cirincione, who was the former president of the Plowshares Fund, which is the US's largest nuclear disarmament foundation. And he says, women across DMZ have convincingly demonstrated that we cannot end North Korea's nuclear program without a comprehensive peace. So women have a particular stake in resolving the Korean War due to the gendered impacts of war and militarism. Women have long called for peace, but have largely been excluded from formal peacemaking initiatives. Korean women have faced some of the highest costs of this conflict. During the war, women were responsible for finding food and shelter. After the war, and with the mass stationing of US troops in South Korea, the system of military prostitution established under Japanese rule continued. The South Korean and US governments used women in camp towns to strengthen military alliances and fuel the South Korean economy, yet these women were stigmatized and silenced. South Korea and North Korea have become highly militarized societies, which is correlated with higher gender inequality and greater violence against women. This also redirects resources away from healthcare, childcare, and other things that disproportionately impact women. And in North Korea, sanctions impact women economically, socially, and physically. Sanctions cause delays in the delivery of life-saving humanitarian aid and target industries heavily employing women, such as textiles and trade sectors. So let me conclude. As transnational feminists, we recognize that it is critical to end the Korean War, not just because of the threat of nuclear annihilation, but because the status quo of the unresolved war is violence. Violence against separated families, violence against innocent North Korean civilians living under sanctions, and violence against Korean people living under national security laws in both Koreas. We must also recognize how the unresolved Korean War impacts others in the region, from the Okinawan people who live with the environmental impacts of sprawling US military bases, to the Chamorro indigenous people of Gwahan, who would be first in line in the case of North Korean retaliation against a first strike, to everyone here in Hawaii, who in 2018 came face to face with the frightening possibility of a North Korean missile attack. Australians too are not immune either from militarization or being drawn into another Korean war. Ending this longest US war will tangibly improve people's lives throughout the Asia-Pacific region, and I believe help neutralize the great power competition between the US and China, which we are all being dragged into. Peace is the only way forward, and with women leading the way, I believe we can and we must end this war. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you so much. We're so grateful for, yeah, if we could applaud you, there'd be lots of applause now because you've really laid out both the compelling reasons driving the recommendations in the report, as well as challenging some of these ways and barriers in which thinking about this issue might be a barrier to opening up some of these really important ways forward, but also acknowledging the extraordinary collective effort that went into this report as well. So all of that important nuance and complexity that comes through so clearly in your points, Christine. And so we're so grateful, really grateful. And we'd like to now welcome Mary. Mary, I'm just going to reintroduce you briefly because we've had some friends join us a little late. So Mary Joyce is Northeast Asia Regional Liaison Officer for the Global Partnerships for the Prevention of Armed Conflict, GPAC. Mary is also part of Women Cross DMZ and the Goodwill Ambassador for Peace on the Korean Peninsula. You've also got connections here in Australia, Mary, and so we're really thrilled that you're able to share some of your thoughts and reflections. Welcome, Mary.
Great. Good morning or afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Tanya, for the introduction. I'm joining you today from Tokyo in Japan, where I'm based. But as mentioned, I'm originally from Melbourne and a graduate of arts at Uni Melbourne. So I'm really glad to have this opportunity virtually to be connecting, and really grateful that the university and particularly the Initiative for Peacebuilding is having this platform to share this really extremely useful report with a broader audience in Australia as well. And also thank you to Christine and the many different people who, as was mentioned, were involved in putting together this report. I see a few of them joining in the participants today as well, actually. So really just want to say an enormous thanks to all of the work that's gone into this report and this campaign, which I think is really very useful for us as we are looking at these different issues as well. Of course, this is a very timely opportunity for us to be having this conversation, as mentioned, with Moon Jae-in now in Australia. I think this is a really great opportunity for people in Australia to be thinking about what these developments on the Korean Peninsula really mean for Australia, what kind of role Australia can be playing here, but also, of course, what responsibility Australia has as part of this as well. You know, of course, given as a key actor in the region today in terms of, security and so on, but more than that, having been a country which participated in the Korean War, of course, as part of the UN multinational forces, and also the role that Australia still plays today in the UN command as well. The deputy commander at the moment, for example, is an Australian personnel, and still contributing our personnel to the UN command in this way, I think really shows how we as Australians have a responsibility to be engaging with and looking for resolution to these challenges which are being faced at the moment as well. And of course, looking at, for example, during Moon Jae-in's visit in Australia, how there's been this focus on the military equipment deals. This $1 billion deal, which was just signed this week as well, I think shows how this is really something which is so closely connected to Australian concerns as well. As Christine mentioned, of course, this ongoing state of war in the Korean Peninsula has, well, of course, a sort of huge and tragic impact on the Korean Peninsula and the Korean people. This really has huge regional implications. And a lot of my work is focusing on Northeast Asian regional collaborative activities within civil society. So today I'd like to share a little bit about some of these regional implications, some of what regional civil society, what kind of peacebuilding initiatives, just a couple of examples of these which are being led, and then tie this in a little bit to the denuclearization issue, which Christine touched upon in her wonderful introduction of the report as well. Of course, when we consider the implications of what this ongoing state of war means, it's not only talking about what could potentially happen if there were to be an armed conflict in the future, it's also looking at what is already the reality for people who are living within the region as well. This ongoing situation is so much used as a reason for military build-up within Northeast Asia, which continues to impact the lives and security of people. Northeast Asia is, a part of the world which is home to 1/5 of the world's population and makes up a quarter of the world's GDP. So really, this is something which has implications on a global scale as well. To share a couple of examples from Japan, where I'm based, for example, this perceived threat from North Korea and from China is what is always given as the reason for the necessity for ongoing military buildup here, for the ongoing presence of the United States bases here, as Christine mentioned, in Okinawa, for example. Okinawa, these are islands which are only 0.6% of all of Japan's area by land area, but there's a concentration of more than 70% of the US military bases in Japan within these islands as well, where they are facing, as Christine mentioned, environmental contamination issues, a huge series of US military related incidents, also including sexual violence and so on as well, which are really things which are impacting on an everyday level the peace and security of people in this region as well. Also, under the new Kishida government here in Japan, which is sometimes presented as more of a dove within the ruling Liberal Democratic Party, at the same time we have these discussions toward the very real possibility of Japan revising its national security strategy, which would adopt a policy to obtain the capacity to attack enemy bases, which is one of the points under discussion at the moment within the Japanese government. This would include the option of deploying long-range missiles in Japan that can be launched immediately upon detection of any move on the side of an enemy for a missile attack towards Japan. And this would mean a fundamental change in Japan's security posture, which has been to date provided as being a purely defensive posture, in accordance, of course, also with Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution, the Peace Clause, which was implemented after World War II. So this could be a recipe really for further arms race escalating throughout the region. So we see how this ongoing situation is being used for this military buildup and increase in competition within the region as well. This is, of course, deeply connected also to AUKUS, which is something of great concern for everyone in Australia. I'm sure there'll be more discussion about this perhaps from others, so I won't go into detail. But of course, this pact is something which has had a very mixed reaction within the Northeast Asian region. There have been, of course, concerns raised by the DPRK government about how this would upset the strategic balance in the region and lead to a further arms race. Not sharing this necessarily as, just to repeat what the DPRK government has been saying, but rather to highlight that these are real concerns in regards to this stability and how this impacts the broader regional situation here as well. And this is, of course, very much connected to the nuclear submarine technology and the Republic of Korea's pursuit in this kind of technology as well, and how what kind of implications this would have for the Korean Peninsula and the situation there. This is perhaps something that others might talk about or in the Q&A there, so I'll leave the AUKUS discussion to that part, but just to really highlight that this is something of great relevance and concern when we're looking at the Korean Peninsula as well. But of course, it's not only that there are these regional implications, but also regional civil society is very much mobilizing and trying to work together to look at resolutions or ways to deal with this ongoing situation in a way that can redefine security away from this militarized perspective, more in something which is more a human-based perspective, we could say. Particularly in Northeast Asia, which is a part of the world where there are no regional frameworks for cooperation and dialogue, and where bilateral relations between states are either tense or even non-existent in many cases. There are many different local and regional NGOs who are leading these efforts for peace building and dialogue on the regional level in Northeast Asia. One example of that is the initiative which the Network which I'm coordinating, GPAC, or the Global Partnership for the Prevention of Armed Conflict, has been initiating. As an example, in 2015, we launched what we call the Ulambata Process. This is a civil society-led dialogue for peace in Northeast Asia, but particularly focusing on the Korean Peninsula. We coordinate this together with a Mongolian NGO called Blue Banner, promoting effective regional civil society or academic level dialogue. Some might refer, track 2 dialogue in a sense, seeking to strengthen the role of civil society in this region as a complement to these long-stalled official processes where there really hasn't been as much progress as we need to be seeing. And also working towards the more development of an institutionalized regional peace and security mechanism for Northeast Asia as well. So this is one of the only standing platforms which brings together on a regular basis civil society and people, including representatives from both North and South Korea, to meet and engage with each other regularly in peace dialogues. And this is something which is really, really vital in terms of having this kind of safe and open space where there can be people from both of these countries and the other countries who are relevant or involved as well, to be even in contact with each other is something which is so lacking in the region. So we've been very much, and also working together with CPCS and the EMA and others as well, in trying to ensure that there are more and more spaces for this kind of regional dialogue for civil society and people from the region to get together, recognizing that we're not going to be able to resolve these issues without having people from all of the parts of the region that are involved being part of this discussion as well. Another example, just to really share very briefly, is led by South Korean civil society, including many of those who are involved in preparing the report, and with the cooperation of many other groups throughout Northeast Asia and beyond as well. And this is the Korea Peace Appeal. This is a campaign which was launched last year by more than 300 different South Korean groups on really a range across the spectrum, from peace groups to women's groups, youth groups, faith groups, and so on as well. And they are working to collect 100 million signatures in support of a peace agreement by 2023, which is the 70th anniversary of the armistice agreement as well. So just to highlight that that's also one of the sort of real public awareness campaigns that is being launched and led by Korean civil society at the moment in regards to this, which we're very honored to support. And just to highlight as well that cooperation within the broader Asian Pacific region really has a very important key role to play here. This is where Southeast Asia comes in, and a lot of the great work that CPCS and EMA are doing, providing this safe space for dialogue in Cambodia, or Women Cross DMZ, for example, has organized meetings with women from both North and South Korea in Indonesia in the past, for example, as well. And this is also where I think it's very useful for us to be considering what kind of role Australia can or should be playing when we're looking at the Korean Peninsula. And just to share very briefly to close, looking at this regional situation, of course, the nuclearization issue is really at the forefront of most of these discussions regarding peace and security here in Northeast Asia. Christine, in her presentation, so wonderfully outlined the report's conclusion that ending the war with a peace agreement would indeed actually potentially create the conditions or more effective engagement on denuclearization. And I wanted to highlight that within the Northeast Asian context, we had just this week, just a few days ago on December 10th, actually, Mongolia became the first state in Northeast Asia to join the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which Christine referred to as well. Mongolia is a very interesting country in that it is a single state nuclear weapon-free zone, which has been recognized by all of the Security Council countries. And it is very much trying to play this role in creating space for dialogue, both on the governmental and civil society levels, which is connected to what we're doing as GPAC, which I mentioned as well. So I think it's very useful for us to be thinking also about what kinds of significance the nuclear ban treaty could potentially have for peace and denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula. There has been discussion, for example, led by some members of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, or ICAN, which is of course the Nobel Laureate organization, which was founded in Melbourne, looking at how, for example, how it might be possible for both Koreas to join this nuclear ban treaty, or what this might mean for a potential verified disarmament process for the Korean Peninsula. Or there has also been advocacy, for example, towards a joint accession by both Koreas, or also by both Koreas and Japan, for example, to the nuclear ban treaty as well, as a step towards creating a more accountable and sustainable nuclear weapon-free Korean Peninsula and broader Northeast Asia as well. So I think it's quite interesting for us to think about how this might be something of relevance as well. And as the report outlines, The fairest and most desirable course of action, not just for the parties to the Korean War, but for humanity as a whole, is for all nuclear armed states to join the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. So I think I'll just end with those nice words from the report and look forward to the different input that others will be sharing as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mary. So much there that I'm sure people were holding in their minds in relation to not just Australia's weaving in this, but also thinking about some of those really important issues at the heart. So thank you so much, Mary. We'd like to welcome Dr. Jae Song, who is University of Melbourne Korea Foundation Senior Lecturer in Korean Studies, and we're really looking forward, Jay, to also hearing your thoughts and reflections in relation to not only the work you do, but also this important report. Welcome, Jay.
Sure. Thank you so much, Tanya, and thanks for organizing this very important event. Thanks, Nathan. And I see in the participant list that Professor John Langmore is here. And also see some familiar names from Korea. And I'm sharing the sentiment about the Zoom webinar that we are joining the forces and interests about the peace and security on the Korean Peninsula issue together. So thanks for organizing this event. And very fascinated about this new initiative for peace building. So it's not just focusing on one part of the world, but it's we're sharing this same cause and interest about peace building around the world. So it's really fascinating development within the University of Melbourne about this new initiative for peace building. So thank you very much for that. As you can probably read the report, it's a fantastic report. So congratulations, Christine and other collaborators for launching this report. I'm trying my best to share this report with people in Blue House in Seoul, and I'm sure Christine and others are doing best to share it with the people in Washington as well. So often it's described, the peace movement is described as a naive, tree-hugging idealist agenda, and it's totally not. As you can see in the report, it's a very practical, and as Christine said, it's a very realistic proposal and a path to establish peace and security on the Korean Peninsula. Peace is the path, as Christine said in the report, is a basis for all other humanitarian issues and human rights issues that has been hanging on the Korean Peninsula over the past 70 years. Korean people who are living, not just the Koreans, but also foreigners who are living on the Korean Peninsula are the victims of this post-war violence, a structure that's embedded since the end of the Korean War, because it didn't end with a peace treaty. It, as we all know, in July 1953, it has ended with an armistice, basically a ceasefire, and that regime has been dividing the country into two, and that deep psychological impact that it had with the people who are living on the Korean Peninsula is still a lingering problem, and it's a source of many other problems and social evils on the Korean politics and society. The constant surveillance and mistrust and the hatred, regionalism between Gyeongsang people and Jeolla people, not just between North and South Korea, it's creating the constant structure and system of mistrust and surveillance in Korean Peninsula. And as Christine mentioned, it's also breathing the violence against women in many respects on the militarism and the authoritarianism. And South Korea has achieved democracy only in 1983. Don't forget that it's not just the North Korea has been ruling with the authoritarian and the oppressive, governance, but it was also South Korea until 1987 before the civil society and the student and opposition leaders, politicians have led this democratization movement. Korea was under a series of military dictatorship and authoritarianism. So it's really breathing that having only the ceasefire, the armistice at the end of the Korean War is breeding all sorts of other social problems in the entire Korean Peninsula, not to mention about the grave human rights violation happening in North Korea. I know human rights and activists and the humanitarian and the women's peace activists have different agendas. So there are certain things that they wouldn't say or say more proactively in public domain. So I totally understand that peace activists still need to engage with their counterpart in North Korea. So when it comes to human rights issue, there are certain things that you actually deliberately don't say in public domain. I want the audience to understand that sort of a delicate sort of toggling or juggling between this discourse and the choose of words in their public campaign. So it's not that the peace activists are going about and putting out these naive ideas about establishing peace on the Korean Peninsula out of blue, but it's very calculated and very practical and very politically calculated movements in this political landscape, and not just on the Korean Peninsula, but on the entire region. And that's the first thing I want to mention about this peace activism. It's not a naive idealist agenda, but it is the very practical and politically realistic option to achieve in this current political environment. The second thing about human rights, I know there are some people who are working on the human rights activism in the domain in Korea and Northeast Asia and around the world. Peace is a very fundamental human rights because we don't have the peace agreement on the Korean Peninsula. The freedom of information, we're not just talking about the North Koreans don't have a freedom access to information about outside world, but also South Koreans under the national security law. We can't visit North Korea without the government permission. We can't visit the country. We can't meet North Koreans or people from North Korea. We need to report and have the permission from the government. So it's really prohibiting that freedom of movement, freedom of information, access to information between the two Koreas. And physically and geographically, in the middle of the Korean Peninsula, there's basically a 4-kilometer belt in the middle of that geography that's blocking any communication or freedom of movement between the two Koreas. So people are basically blocked for the past 70 or so years that they can't visit their relatives, their friends, their collaborators in many aspects of the society and economy. There has been some experimental the industrial complex that was tried by the previous South Korean government. That's also been halted because of the deteriorated relation between the two Koreas. And as I mentioned briefly, having no peace agreement is breeding the violence against women in every aspect. On the militarism, there is a prostitutes, sexual violence victims in the near the U.S. base, and the general militaristic culture and environment is excluding women from politics and important senior positions in economy, society, and politics. The women are having facing this violation and discrimination against their gender and sexual orientation as well. And again, not just women, but also the youth, the young people, and the LGBTIQA+ communities are also excluded from this peace dialogue or any kind of working dialogue between the two Koreas and between South Korea and even China, US working level dialogue. These groups are marginalized and excluded from the conversation. There's also a worrying sign in recent years in South Korean politics. There's a growing anti-feminism sentiment amongst the far-right politicians and the groups who are supporting those rightist politicians. They're going against the feminism and women's rights movement, and they're calling names against each other. And the current leader of the opposition party, the Conservative Party, is a young lad, Lee Jun-seok, and he's leading that sort of a group of anti-women, anti-feminist movement. He's gaining a lot of popular votes amongst the younger men in South Korea. That's a really worrying sign. And South Korea will have a presidential election soon, early next year. And we will have to see the changing political landscape there and how it impacts on the peace dialogue between the two Koreas and between South Korea and the US and other nations around the Korean Peninsula. And lastly, peace is a fundamental human rights, but it's also having an implication for the future generation. It's called the third generation human rights. It's a collective right for all, not just the first generation civil and political rights and the second generation of socio-economic rights, but it's setting a stone for the more futuristic a prospect on the Korean Peninsula, inclusive of the young generation, inclusive of the diverse minority, migrant groups, and the sexual minorities on the Korean Peninsula. So it's having a peace agreement is not just about solving the conflict and the national security, defense related issue, but it's also having a broader implication for the entire Korean society, youth issues and the social injustice and other minority groups will be also a potential beneficiary of this peace agreement. So it's extremely important, not just on the security and defense front of the stories, but having a broader implication for more futuristic prospect on the Korean politics and society. And of course, I didn't talk much about the people who are living on the other side of the Korean, the DMZ, the North Korean. But once the border is open, once potentially a US embassy is set in Pyongyang, and there are more communication with the outside world, eventually they will bring in more information and flow of information, and the movement of people will change the society and economy gradually. And that's what we are all ultimately aim for. So it's extremely important activism, and also it has to be included in the policy dialogue as well. So I'll just stop here, and I'm looking forward to a Q&A session, more about the the regional sort of landscape and security front. Thank you.
Yeah, we're so grateful. Thank you so much. I'd like to invite Dr. Emma Leslie. Emma is the director of the Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies, and we're so happy to be holding this conversation and launch with you, Emma. And we welcome your thoughts and reflections, having listened to our wonderful panelists who are friends and collaborators. So thank you, Emma.
Thank you, Tanya, and thanks to the initiative for partnering continuously on cutting-edge peace-building issues. And one of the reasons that we really wanted to partner with you on this one, and particularly to gather this tireless team of peace leaders on this call, is because I'm deeply concerned about the narrative that we have in Australia around this whole Korean Peninsula issue. Is when I was growing up in Australia, every year in April, we take school children to watch Anzac Day parades. And in the years that I was going to Anzac Day parades, we would always see the Korean War veterans. And as everybody knows, Australia sent 17,000 soldiers to fight in the Korean War. We would see the veterans walking down the road, and on the banners that they hold, it would say, served in the Korean War, 1950 to 1953. And so I grew up understanding that the Korean War was over, and it was something deep in the past and something that we didn't need to think about anymore. And so, of course, when I had the opportunity later to be involved in Korean peace issues, thanks to some good friends who facilitated now 5 visits to North Korea. We've had the opportunity to visit Pyongyang, amazing experiences, connecting with people, visiting schools, visiting kindergartens, going to farms, seeing that the Korean Peninsula, of course, is still, as you've heard on this call, in war. And yet, in North Korea, everyday people trying to live out their lives, heavily sanctioned, isolated from the world, cut off from being able to communicate to their family in other parts of the peninsula and the world, but also potentially because of that, a dire humanitarian situation. So the war is not over. And I can see on this call today, there are lots and lots of supporters of the ongoing conversation around the world. But what we really need to do in Australia is mainstream this conversation. A few years ago, my nephew was in grade 3 in primary school, and he watched one of those behind the news things in class. And he rang me and said, Auntie Emma, I'm really worried that we're going to get blown up by North Korea, that we're going to have bombs put on us. And I was horrified to think that the next generation is already being told this narrative as young as age 7. So Australia, we need to get our stuff together. Is that in 2 more years, this war will have gone on for 70 years. And in my so-called expertise in peace building, I don't know how long is a good war, but 70 years seems to me like enough. If we go beyond 70 years, we move deeply into a new generation who don't celebrate or remember the Korean War as something deep in our past, but it becomes live again. And so I am entirely committed to this wonderful team of women here who are saying enough is enough. And it's really not that hard. To declare the war over is a massive, even if it's symbolic, it's a massive moment for all Korean people. And it gives us a momentum, a possibility to move beyond what is currently an armistice, and frankly, not even a very well implemented armistice. So we have people all around the world today talking about ceasefires, talking about peace processes, peace process design. And yet on this issue, it's almost like a non-issue. Australia signs a new deal for more weapons, buying and selling. We have to stop this narrative within the next 2 years. And so for whatever Australians are on this call today, I really want to ask us to start working together. Melbourne is kicking us off, but we need to have this conversation across the whole country. We need to make it a conversation that political parties pick up. It needs to be something that Australians are horrified to think that we have been going on with this crazy narrative for some time, but we're also planting it into a new generation. I was able to travel with Rotarians from Australia to Pyongyang, people that were regular business people, Melbourne, Queensland. They were shocked to discover that they could be friends with North Koreans. The kind of propaganda that comes with the narrative that those people are bad, those people are isolated, far from us, all crazy, North Koreans are robotic, is really, really horrifying. And so actually for those Rotarians to sit down, have a beer, have a meal together, talk about their children, talk about their lives, and to realize that everyday North Koreans are just normal people like the rest of us, and yet for some reason we want to continue to punish them for whatever reason. We have to end this war right now. I'm sorry not to be so articulate, but I feel so passionate that it's a time for Australia to show up in this conversation. And I'm so grateful, Tanya, that you've brought this space for us all today.
Likewise, I'm really grateful that we have this space, and the initiative for peace building was with John, and we've got Nathan and Hadil on the phone as well, but this is the very type of conversation we want to have, and we agree that we need to bring in as many people as possible, because even myself, I did my MA in Tokyo, and then went on to work in Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia, and never find how best to have those conversations to invite a more open and humane discussion about what are people's lives and what are very real. And Christine and Jay and Mary and Emma, you've done a really wonderful job of articulating not just the analysis behind it, but the very practical ways in which we can all find ways to support change, and let's keep elevating and raising that discussion. I promised a Q&A, and we've got a 5-minute window to invite our participants, who I'm sure have really enjoyed hearing from everyone. So we've got a hello, but do we have a question from, do we have a question, or let's just give people a moment. So John Kim.
Sounds like a friendly hello from John Kim.
Not sure if it's a hello, let me ask a question, or if it's just a hello. John, is it a question?
Yes, thank you for the excellent presentation to all the panelists. And my question is, how optimistic are you about the possibility of, reaching a peace agreement on the Korean Peninsula in the coming years, hopefully by the 2023, which will be the anniversary of the 70th anniversary of signing the armistice agreement. Can we have really a peace agreement in Korea? The reason I'm asking this question is I saw a news item coming from Washington, D.C. a few days ago. Some of you maybe also read the news, but the Biden administration imposed a new sanctions against North Korea a few days ago. And this is the first time the new administration is imposing new sanctions against North Korea. And that included one of the cartoon studio in North Korea, which creates animation videos for young children and so on. So I was amazed by the extent of the Washington establishment is trying to put more pressure on North Korea and continue the lingering Korean War into an indefinite future.
Thank you, John.
I feel like the Biden administration is going back to the old Obama administration's strategic patience, just waiting for North Korea to collapse. So
if I could respond really quickly, John, because I know we're out of time here. And if I could just quickly respond, who knows what's going to happen, but that's why we have to build this global civil society and peace movement to really put the pressure. And I think it's going to be really sadly contingent upon what happens in South Korea with the elections in March. But irrespective of that, in the United States, I've been a peace activist doing this work for so long. And a decade ago, when we gathered in Washington, D.C. on the 60th anniversary of the Korean War, we could only get 2 members of Congress to support peace on the Korean Peninsula, much less a peace agreement with North Korea. Today, we have a congressional resolution with 50 co-sponsors of a bill calling for peace on the Korean Peninsula. There is a conversation about an end of war declaration. We are the bright light. We have the solutions. We offer a vision of hope, prosperity, peace, families, human rights. And I think this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to win the hearts and minds of people with us, good, peace-loving Australians, to say we have to support an end to the Korean War, especially since Australia sent 17,000 troops in this war, and it has never officially ended. I'm hopeful.
I'm sharing the same sentiment, same optimism. I mean, it's not going to happen next year or a year after. I mean, it's a long process, and we have to have a great deal of patience. And I see that, John Kim, you're probably one of the Korean overseas diaspora, and we should continuously support this kind of peace activism around the world. It's not the Korean affairs, it's an international affairs. Korea War was probably started as a civil war, but it became international war. So everyone is responsible for ending this war.
Thank you so much, Jay and Christine. I'm noticing that now we're warming up with the questions, but actually we've come to an end. And so I'm wondering maybe we should have a continuation of this conversation in the year. And Pinghu and Jonathan and others, we appreciate that it's stimulating these questions, and it's conversations we need to have and we need to bring others into. And we're so grateful, Christine, Jay, Mary and Emma, for all that you gave us and that all we'll think about and move forward in and look for ways in which we can support and can bring others into this conversation and continue to build this sort of regional engagement, as well as that deep introspection we need wherever we are. And in Australia, that was really strongly communicated. And lastly, I just want to acknowledge Alison Lee, who did a wonderful job of bringing this together from CPCS. Thank you very much, and thank you to our participants. We really appreciate this opportunity, and thank you again. And if you haven't read the report, please do and be in touch. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tanya. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Tanya, Nathan, Alison, everyone.
Bye, everyone.